Jack stepped through the glass doors of the high-rise building, feeling the cool air of the corporate world hit him all at once. The lobby was spotless, modern, and sleek, with marble floors and high ceilings that made him feel even more out of place. His military uniform was crisp and well-kept, but it didn't seem to fit in here. The polished suits and tight smiles of the people walking past him only served as a reminder of how different things were now. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a place of business, a place he'd never been. He felt his palms start to sweat as he approached the receptionist. The woman behind the desk gave him a quick, professional smile as she handed him a visitor's badge. "You're here for the interview, right? Mr. Jack Turner?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "Yes," Jack replied, his voice a little hoarse. He hadn't realized how dry his throat was until he tried to speak. He took the badge and followed her directions, heading to the waiting area. It was all so sterile, so clean. No noise, no urgency, just calm, calculated quiet. It made his chest tighten. He didn't belong here. He sank into one of the leather chairs, trying to steady his breathing. His thoughts wandered, memories of the years he'd spent in the military, flooding back. The constant motion, the drills, the sound of helicopters overhead, the heavy weight of a weapon in his hands. The faces of the men he'd lost in combat. The friends he'd promised he'd protect. The ones he couldn't save. His mind replayed every mission, every decision, every moment when he'd felt helpless. The scars weren't just on his body, they were buried deep in his soul, and he carried them with him every day. He'd never told anyone about the burden he bore, not even his family. He was supposed to be strong. He had to be. He had made a promise to himself that, when he left the military, he would find a way to heal, to start fresh, to build something new. This job, this interview, was supposed to be the first step. But now, sitting here, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. What if he wasn't good enough for this world? What if they looked at him and saw a soldier who didn't fit in anywhere anymore? The thought made his heart race. He pushed the anxiety aside, though. There was no going back now. He had to push forward. He had to try. The door to the conference room opened, and a soft voice called out, "Mr. Turner?" Jack stood up, his legs feeling heavier than they should, but he forced himself to walk forward. A sense of duty, a sense of purpose. Those were the things he had relied on during his years in the military. Now, they were his anchors, keeping him steady as he stepped into the room. Inside, the space was polished and pristine, just like the rest of the building. The walls were a mix of glass and modern wood, creating an open, airy feeling. At the head of the long conference table sat Grace, the CEO. She looked exactly as Jack had imagined, calm, confident, and in control. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her sharp business suit gave her an air of authority that made him swallow hard. "Please, take a seat," Grace said, her voice smooth but with a quiet power that demanded attention. She gestured to the chair across from her. Jack nodded and sat down, his uniform feeling even more out of place here. He could feel his heart pounding, but he kept his hands steady on the table. Grace smiled at him, a welcoming gesture, though there was a hint of distance in her eyes. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would offer sympathy. She was here to evaluate, to make decisions. Jack knew that. "So, Mr. Turner," she began, her tone businesslike yet warm, "let's start with your background. Tell me about your time in the military." Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I served for 12 years, he began, his voice a little rough. "I was a sergeant first class, specializing in combat operations. I've led teams in high-pressure situations, and I'm trained in a wide range of skills, everything from leadership to tactical planning to dealing with high-stakes environments." Grace nodded, taking notes on her tablet. She didn't interrupt, just gave him time to speak. But as the words left his mouth, he realized how much of his life he had wrapped up in those years. How much of himself he had invested in the uniform, in the missions, in the battles. "And what skills do you think you can bring to our company?" Grace asked, still not looking up from her tablet. Her question was simple, but Jack felt the weight of it. He struggled for a moment, trying to find the right words. How could he explain the value of his experience in a way that made sense in this world? His life had been about surviving, about following orders, about keeping others alive. Could that translate here, in a corporate environment? I'm a problem solver, he said slowly, thinking it through. I've been in situations where the stakes were as high as they could get. I can think on my feet, adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and I know how to stay calm under pressure. But I also know how to work as part of a team, how to lift others up when things get tough. Grace's eyes flicked up to meet his, and Jack felt his breath catch. There was something there, something more than just professional curiosity. Something that made her pause, as if she was considering more than just his words. "And what are you most proud of in your career, Mr. Turner?" she asked, her voice softening just a little. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The question hit him harder than he expected. He thought about the lives he'd saved, the missions he'd led, the medals he had earned. But there were other memories, the ones he couldn't escape, the ones that haunted him. His mind flashed to the moments he wasn't able to save his comrades, the ones who never made it home, the ones who had trusted him, relied on him, only to lose their lives on his watch. For a moment, he froze. The words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, but all that escaped was a shaky breath. He fought to hold it together, to keep the weight of those memories from overwhelming him. Grace noticed the hesitation. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding. She set her tablet down and leaned forward slightly, as if she could sense there was more to Jack's story. "You don't have to answer that if it's too difficult," she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, but there was no hint of condescension. She was giving him space, letting him breathe. Jack exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No, it's not that. It's just... there's a lot of things I carry with me, things I couldn't control, things I wish I could change." Grace nodded, her expression steady. She didn't rush him. Instead, she asked softly, "What do you think is the hardest part of transitioning from the military to civilian life?" That question struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't just about a job, about fitting into an office. It was about fitting into a life that no longer made sense. A life where the rules weren't the same, where everything felt foreign and uncertain. "It's the silence," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the army, you're always moving, always doing something. But when you leave, the silence, the waiting, it's deafening. You don't know who you are outside of what you've done, and sometimes it feels like you're lost." Grace's gaze didn't waver. She simply nodded, understanding more than Jack had expected. The moment stretched, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like someone saw him, really saw him. As the interview continued, Jack found himself saying less and less about his skills and more about the things that weighed heavily on him. Grace didn't press him for more details on his military experience. Instead, she asked questions that made him think about who he was now, who he wanted to become. "Tell me about your biggest fear in this transition," she asked, her voice calm but probing. Jack hesitated. His mind raced with all the things he hadn't allowed himself to think about before. The fear of failure, the fear of being forever changed in a way that no job, no civilian life could ever fix. "I fear that I'm not enough anymore," Jack confessed, his voice low. "In the army, everything was clear. There was a mission, there were people depending on you. I knew my role, but out here I feel like I don't have a purpose, like I don't belong." Grace sat back slightly in her chair, her eyes fixed on him, but there was no judgment. Instead, her gaze seemed to say, "I understand. You carry a heavy weight," she said softly. "That's something many of us struggle with after we leave the military. The guilt, the loss, the uncertainty about who we are when we no longer wear the uniform. It's not easy to step into the unknown after that." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard the words before, but hearing them from her, someone who understood, hit him differently. She wasn't just some corporate executive asking standard interview questions. She was seeing him, really seeing him, and for a moment, it was almost too much to bear. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally share everything that had been bottled up inside for so long. But before he could, Grace leaned forward slightly, her expression more serious now. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned earlier." He looked at her, confused. What could she possibly have to add at this point? "I was in the military too," she said, her words like a sudden revelation that caught Jack completely off guard. "I served for 8 years, and I know exactly what it's like." The room seemed to stop for a moment. Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never expected this. How could he have? She was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, not someone who had worn a uniform, not someone who had experienced the kind of life he had. "You?" he managed, his voice shaky. "I never." Grace nodded, a small, sad smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I don't talk about it much. But I was in a special operations unit. And just like you, I came back home, not knowing who I was anymore, not knowing how to fit in." Jack's heart began to race. The walls he had built up around himself, the ones that had kept him from truly opening up to anyone, started to crack. Grace wasn't just the CEO of a company, she was a fellow soldier. She understood more than Jack had ever imagined. She went on, her voice steady but laced with pain. "When I came back, I felt just like you, empty, like I had left a part of myself somewhere on the battlefield, but I didn't have anyone to talk to about it, not until much later. Not until I realized that even in this new life, the struggle didn't just disappear. It doesn't go away. It never does." Jack's mind reeled. He hadn't expected this at all. Here in front of him was a woman who had walked the same path, faced the same demons, and yet had somehow found her way into this position of power and control. "Hell?" She leaned forward again, her gaze soft but intense. "I know it's hard. I know the guilt, the doubt, the pain of seeing the faces of the men and women you couldn't save. I've lived it. I've carried that burden. But you don't have to carry it alone. You don't have to carry it in silence." Jack sat there, stunned, his emotions swirling. For the first time he felt a shift, something that was more than just a job interview. This was a moment of connection. Something raw and real. Grace wasn't just offering him a job, she was offering him understanding. Something he hadn't even known he needed. "I'm not here to fix you, Jack," she continued, her voice thick with sincerity. "But I want you to know that it's okay to let yourself heal. It's okay to be broken. We're all in this together." Jack blinked back the tears that suddenly stung his eyes. He hadn't realized how badly he had been craving someone who could truly see him, someone who understood the things that haunted him. And here she was, offering him more than just a chance at a job. She was offering him the opportunity to heal. The connection between them, forged in the crucible of shared experience, was stronger than Jack could have imagined. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. As the minutes passed, the conversation shifted from small talk to something deeper, something real. Jack had expected the usual questions, the expected answers, but he hadn't expected to be heard so thoroughly, so truly. Grace's presence felt like an anchor, steady and unyielding, but also soft, as if she understood the complexity of his emotions without needing to press him. Jack's heart pounded as he felt something inside him start to crack open. He hadn't planned on sharing this, hadn't planned on telling anyone, least of all a complete stranger. But Grace wasn't just any stranger. She was someone who had walked the same path, fought the same battles, and felt the same emptiness. So slowly he started to speak. "My best friend," Jack began, his voice shaking as he spoke. "He was a good man. We joined the army together. We were inseparable, like brothers. I always promised him I'd bring him home, but I couldn't save him." His voice cracked on the last part, the weight of the guilt pressing heavily on his chest. "I wasn't fast enough, didn't make the right call, and he didn't make it. And every day since, I've wondered if I could have done something different, if I could have kept him alive." There was a long silence as Jack fought to steady his breathing. The pain of that memory, of that loss, cut through him like a knife, raw and unrelenting. His best friend's face flashed in his mind, smiling, laughing, full of life. Gone. Gone because of a mistake he couldn't undo. Grace listened closely, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words of comfort. She just let him speak. Let him pour out the grief and the guilt he had carried for so long. When Jack finished, he felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders, just a little. It wasn't gone, not completely, but for the first time, he didn't feel so alone with it. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but knowing. "Jack," she said softly. "It's okay to feel broken. We all do at some point. We carry our scars, our losses, and they shape us, yes. But what matters is how we rebuild ourselves, how we choose to heal." Jack nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling into him. He had spent so long fighting, so long carrying the burden of his past, that he hadn't allowed himself the grace to heal. Maybe he didn't have to do it alone. Maybe he didn't have to keep running from the pain. Then, to Jack's surprise, Grace made an offer. "Jack, I want to offer you this job," she said, her voice steady but kind. "But not just any position. We have a program here, specifically designed for veterans. It's not just a job, it's a chance to transition into civilian life with support, therapy, mentorship, a team that understands the struggles you've been through." Jack blinked, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. A job? Specifically for veterans? He hadn't expected this. He had come in hoping for a job, hoping for a fresh start, but this was more than that. This wasn't just an offer to work. It was an opportunity to rebuild, to heal, to find a purpose again, but this time with people who understood his pain. Grace continued, her tone sincere and unwavering. "You won't be doing this alone, Jack. There's a community here, a group of people who have walked that same road. We know the struggle, and we'll help you find your way. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better than you were yesterday." Jack's chest tightened, and he felt his eyes well with tears. He had never imagined anything like this. This wasn't just an interview, it was a lifeline, a chance to start over, to stop running from his past, and to find a way to live again, not just survive. The emotions hit him all at once: relief, gratitude, disbelief. He had come in hoping for a job, but what he was being offered was so much more than that. It was a chance to heal, to find a new purpose in a world that no longer made sense. And in that moment, Jack realized that this was exactly what he had been searching for. Something real, something that could help him rebuild himself, piece by piece. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke. Thank you for this." Grace's eyes softened, and she gave him a small but genuine smile. "You don't have to thank me. It's the least we can do for someone who's given so much. Welcome to the team, Jack." For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had found the place where he could finally begin to heal. As Jack walked out of the sleek building, the cool air hit his face, but it didn't feel as cold as it had when he first arrived. His mind was still spinning, trying to process everything that had happened in the interview. He had walked in hoping for a job, but what he had been given was so much more. It wasn't just a position. It was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to finally move forward. The weight that had been crushing him for so long felt a little lighter, like a burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted, even if just for a moment. His steps felt different as he walked across the parking lot, more sure, more steady. His shoulders, once tense and hunched, were a little straighter now. He had expected the anxiety, the fear, the pressure of having to perform, to be perfect in the eyes of a stranger. But Grace hadn't been a stranger. She had been a mirror, reflecting back the parts of himself he had hidden away, the parts he had been too afraid to face. She understood his struggles without needing him to say much at all. And in doing so, she had offered him something far more valuable than a job. She had offered him understanding, compassion, and the space to heal. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the weight of the day began to catch up with him. The emotional turmoil of the interview, the confession he hadn't meant to make, the memories he hadn't intended to revisit, all of it rushed through him. But this time, he didn't fight it. He let the tears fall, not out of sadness, but because for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than numbness. Hope. It was a strange feeling, one that Jack hadn't allowed himself to embrace in a long time. But as he stood there, under the bright sky, it settled in him like something solid, something real. He hadn't just been offered a job, he had been given a chance to start over, to rebuild himself from the inside out. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be worth it. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the future ahead of him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than the man he had been. Maybe he could finally heal. And as he walked toward his car, Jack realized that this wasn't just the start of a new job. It was the beginning of a new life. Thank you for watching this deeply emotional journey of Jack, a soldier who found more than just a job, but a chance to heal, and rebuild his life. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life can lead to the greatest moments of growth and hope. If you felt moved by Jack's story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that there's always hope, even in the darkest moments. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of Jack's journey resonated with you the most? Thanks for being part of this journey with us.